What's up, guys? This video is different from what I've been previously making because this one's entirely unscripted. I want to talk about the game I've been working on as a solo dev, where I get to share both the experience I had making it while also offering advice to others who are interested in becoming or have just also recently started trying what being a video game dev is like. There's a lot of different topics I want to cover related to this journey, and I'm also really anxious to see what people think about the first publicly available game I've made is like. So to start off, I want to talk about what is, in my opinion, the most difficult part of becoming a video game developer, which is starting. There's a lot of useful and helpful information on the internet to get started, but since there's just so much of it, it can be really overwhelming to know where to start or what to do at all. When it comes to the actual game engine, you really just gotta pick the one you feel the most comfortable with. They're all fine, whether it's Unreal, Unity, or Godot. The real choice that I think is important to make beyond that is just which video to start with as a guide if you're not comfortable just toying around with the engine by yourself. The video I found the most helpful to start with is one where you just follow the instructions of someone else making a game, similar to like putting a Lego set together with an instruction manual. There are loads of different content creators like Brackeys or Unreal Sensei that have guides where by the end of the video you'll have a complete game made. And what I think is so important about starting with this is about the next step, which is using those assets they gave you to make something entirely different. A huge part of game development is using your assets to the fullest and using them in unique and different ways. And I think that not having to worry about making your own assets at first helps relieve a huge hurdle of getting into game development. With these assets they've provided you, you can just let your imagination run wild and make whatever you are able to with what they've provided. For me personally, I followed a guide made by Jonas Tyler where in Unity he made a bunch of short games such as clicking bricks to make them disappear so that a ball can fall in the basket, or having like a grudge match where you control one ball and you try and push the other off the map. He even incentivized what I was saying at the end of his video, where after giving you all these scripts, he was like, go make something completely new using these scripts. That's exactly what I did, and I definitely felt like it helped me get a better understanding of the work environment that the engine I was working on allows for. I also think there's genuine value as someone who's interested in being a game dev to play a game such as Super Mario Maker, where you're just messing around in the level editors making your own levels, because once again, it's allowing you in a controlled environment where you don't have to worry about the art and you can just level design without that worry. Once you've practiced enough of building levels using pre-made assets and feeling more comfortable in your engine's environment, you're probably going to want to be making your own assets soon. Now, a big mistake I commonly see with other new devs is that when they want to make their own assets, they want them at like a super high fidelity quality, and this to me is just a fool's errand that's not worth pursuing in the slightest. Instead, what you should be doing is a concept called gray boxing, which is where you make all your assets using the most simplest of shapes provided by the editor, usually cubes, spheres, and cylinders. This is important because it really lays the foundation for the game you're making. You should absolutely not be committing to high details at this stage because you are rapidly adding and removing things or iterating upon your ideas throughout these early stages of production. and it's a waste of time if you're doing anything else but this. This is especially really helpful for making structures. Unity has a nice add-on called Pro Builder, which lets you make buildings pretty easily without hassle. I used it for making the laboratory and warehouse that are major parts of my game's play space. Now when it comes to making the creatures for my game, I look to Blender. Blender is currently the most popular 3D modeling software, and for good reason. It's fairly easy to use, and it pretty much always gets the job done. Now, when you're like me and you haven't done any Blender previously and you're looking up a guide for how to do it, you're pretty much always going to be recommended the videos by the Blender Guru, where he'll have you making a donut. I really don't recommend following these videos if you're using Blender for game development, because his tutorial is more for people making images for graphic design. What I do recommend, and I unfortunately forget the channel name, I'll put it up on the screen, is this guy has a video where you make a 3D human model, and that is super invaluable to game design because, you know, you might want to have a human model either in to play as, but also just the fact that you can modify this model for any sort of humanoid creature design. The boss fight of my game modifies this human model provided by the video. I found this guide super invaluable to anybody that is trying to make a 3D game, since you'll have your own default humanoid model that can be easily modified to whatever you want it to be. Now, the fun part is that creating the 3D model is just the start. To have a working 3D model, you also need to know how to rig it. Rigging it is basically putting the bones inside the model so that it can move once you've attached to the mesh. So after making your mesh, next you have to make the rig, which is pretty much the bones for the mesh and allows it to move. The same guy who I'm recommending for making the model, he also has a video about how to rig it properly, and it was pretty easy to follow, and I was able to get a working human mesh after watching the guide. I thought it was really cool being able to finally move around the pieces of the mesh and put it in the different poses. And that kind of leads into the last part of making a complete 3D model for your game, which is the animation. The animation is just using a timeline chart and setting the model you've made in different poses and then applying those poses to the timeline so that as the timeline advances, it changes from one pose to the next, creating that animation. Like I said, I really didn't have too many issues with this human model. Where I really had issues though was when I tried to do a dog model. The first problem I rised into is that I was trying to just create a dog mesh from memory and it really wasn't working out. Thankfully I learned that you can import 2D images into Blender's workspace and then trace it with a pane and then extrude the face out and then mirror it. So that way you can make a nice 3D model and use that reference so that it doesn't turn out too bad. Where I was really struggling though with my dog was its rig. For some reason, the bottom jaw would always be doing janky stuff when I'd be setting up in poses for animation. And I would be messing around with the weight paint and what the bones were attached to on the mesh and what parts they moved around, and I just could not fix it by the time I'm releasing this final product. And if anyone knows why wolf bones don't like to work properly, that would be greatly appreciative. So after trying my best to make these 3D models, I followed a different guide on how to import them into Unity, and that one was pretty helpful, and that was actually a pretty straightforward process that I only got better with over time. Another big tip I have is to not care if your model looks like complete shit. It really doesn't matter when you're just setting up the general gameplay of your game. And the nice part is you can update the models into Blender anytime and just re-import them into your game engine with those changes. And it really isn't too bad just shifting over all the script data onto the new model, because you can just copy and paste those scripts over. So that was the process of me making my own assets for my game. So between this and how I started off using basic tutorials, I was honestly feeling pretty good about stuff. And the next part is what I'd like to call advanced tutorials. Now that you've got the basics under your belt, you really will start to need to know more complex aspects of the game engine you're working in. The example I'm going to use for Unity is what NavMesh and NavMesh agents are. When I put my dog in the game and I had a script to make it go to the player, I noticed that it liked to run into walls if it was like in between the player, and it wouldn't properly pathfind. Sure enough, Unity has a nice feature called NavMesh, which allows anything to pathfind, and it was really helpful learning all this information. When it came to finding tutorials for these types of questions, specifically for Unity, I genuinely believe Brackeys is the best source of information on the internet. When it comes to needing to learn things about, nav meshes or particle effects, he always has nice, easily understandable videos that give you the surface level amount of information you need to get started with those tools. I thought it was funny though that as I was making this project, he had just recently come back to make videos about Godot to provide this same level of guidance that he gave to Unity to a different game engine, which is really cool. Anyone who's trying to learn Godot, I highly recommend going to his channel and following him, because he's about to put out so many helpful guides to keep you on the right path. When it comes to these more advanced tools, I think the one that I found very fun to use was the terrain tools. They were very intuitive, and I thought it was really fun to paint the ground with different texture types, like with the grass or sand or rocks, and raising or lowering the terrain to make mountains. Funnily enough, I really could see how Subnautica, one of my favorite games of all time, was made using these tools, because that's also made in Unity's 3D engine. And so seeing myself making like the peaks and crevices with the tool, I was like, oh, this looks exactly like the Crag Cliffs or the Dunes area. I don't know, I just thought that was a fun little thing that I nerded out about while I was creating the terrain of my game. When it came to these more advanced tutorials, this was the part of the experience in my journey where I really felt like,
oh yeah, it's all coming together.
And it really gave me the motivation to keep going and then continue so that I could make a completed project that I could then share with other people. By this point, I also had a pretty clear vision of how big I had the scope for this project and how much I wanted to put into what features I wanted completed, and when it came to testing them, and also just what level of detail I wanted, because I was finally out of that like gray boxing area of development where I just needed the simple stuff to get by and just test things out. Although I will say in the final product, I do have some gray boxing because really there was no reason to go beyond. For example, the player that you control is just a basic ass red cylinder. Like, there's no reason to change it because it's a first person game and you're not going to see yourself. You could make the argument that it kind of sucks that I don't have any sort of hand or leg animations and it probably just feels like you're floating. For my first project, I just found it to be too much detail that really wasn't worth the investment. When it comes to the scope of the game, I'd compare it to a Destiny Strike, if you're familiar with those. About a 5 to 10 minute PvE mission that takes you across a couple different encounters that ends with a boss fight. I put a lot of work into the enemy AI and their spawning algorithms. I have this whole like wave encounter based system where when you enter an encounter, I choose the area where the enemies spawn from, and then I can enter any amount of waves I want to, and then which enemies are contained in those waves. And then when you kill the enemies in the wave, the next one spawns. And then on top of that, during the encounter, I spawn a barrier over any sort of exit that would allow you to leave the arena, so that way you're forced to fight. And then after you defeat all the waves in the encounter, the barriers go down so that you can continue through the level. One of the big hurdles I had with implementing this was when I finally put in a checkpoint system, because previously when you died, I just reset the scene, but I'm personally not a fan of having to redo more than like 3 minutes of gameplay, so I was very generous with checkpoints throughout the experience. And the problem I had once I added these checkpoints was that I now had to manually reset encounter data so that the encounters would restart if you died during them, because I totally soft locked the game before putting this in, because you would die, respawn at a checkpoint, and the barrier and enemies would all still be alive, so you couldn't even enter the arena. That was pretty bad, but thankfully I got that all fixed, and that was like the last thing I had done before shipping the game out. Another thing that I finally ended off with, and like I said earlier, this is a big mistake people make when they're getting into it, is they care about the detail of the textures and like little props thrown in for decoration first, when this should be like the last thing you do. And this was one of the other last things I did. If there's one thing I did not do by myself, was any sort of texture mapping. I have no idea how to make a texture map. It is the only thing where I absolutely did not do any of the work for that myself. All the textures are free textures that you can find on the Unity store page, and thank goodness there's a whole bunch of them for variety for anybody to use, because yeah, I could not be bothered to make my own textures. On top of the textures, I also finally then decided to go through other free assets and just see if there was like props, and thankfully there was loads of crates and barrels and fire extinguishers and chairs and stuff that I could download and then place into my level just to fill things out. You'll see, like, I'll show what my buildings looked like when they were gray boxed or just had the basic textures, and obviously they were just big empty rooms, and filling them out really did bring a bit more life to them and making them more visually interesting, even though it really doesn't affect the moment-to-moment gameplay. When it came to placing all these decorations, it straight up felt like I was playing a Sims game. It was kind of funny that just placing them down was basically a game within itself, and honestly that's how I felt like a lot of these game development aspects, was that it was basically just a game of a load of other games put together. And I think that's why I honestly had so much fun making this. I felt like I was always learning something new, and it was like every different tool I was understanding to use was like its own level entirely. And I definitely now know that I've spent this time learning these tools, it excites me to see what I can make after this game, because I don't have to spend the time to learn those things, but on top of that, I will still obviously be learning new topics. I know a big one I want to do in the future is learning how water surfaces work, because my terrain in this game is just straight ground with some elevation for mountains to make the border of the map, but I definitely want to try and make like a pond or lake or something like that and see how I can get that to look. It wasn't all fun and games though. There were definitely moments where I hard struggled, and they were not enjoyable experiences. The biggest example I have kind of relates to what I was talking about during the animation section, where I was talking about how the wolf bones weren't properly working with the bottom jaw of my dog's animations. That wasn't the only thing about the dog, which in the game is referred to as a storm beast, wasn't working properly. I also had loads of problems trying to mess around with its textures because I too did fall into the trap of trying to make things look good. I was trying to make the fur texture for it so it wasn't just a gray matte, and I could not get fur to working in Blender even though it seemed like it was just an easy modifier you add onto a texture. I did not find it easy. Then what happened was I tried to put on the texture within Unity instead of Blender, and I thought I was saved when I found a free fur texture pack on the asset store. But then this atrocity happened.
Oh my goodness!
I spent so many hours trying to fix this texture map to see if I could make it work, and after about 3 hours in, I just said, fuck it, and I just was fine with the dog looking like how it is, as you're seeing it right now. I did do a redesign during the development phase to make mainly its eyes look a lot better, and then give it like claws on its paws so it wasn't just little stubs. But this was definitely the part of the project where I had wasted the most time, and that probably was what would always cause me the most frustration, was when it felt like I was just wasting time on something and not making progress. I mean, that's a pretty normal feeling on anything to have, but it definitely was a factor that would leave me demoralized the most out of anything that happened while making this game. So something I probably should have said more near the beginning of the video, but I sort of forgot, was just when it comes to trying to make something for the first time too, make something small. Like, I know that you probably want to make something inspired by like your favorite huge AAA game like Elden Ring, or in my case, Destiny, and I think that if you're not gonna make something like maybe an arcade game, and you do want to make a game like one of those big releases, is maybe just do like a snippet, kind of like how I'm doing this to make like a strike of Destiny. Like, say you're a big Soulsborne fan, and you're like, hey, I want to make my own Soulsborne content. Make like a boss fight, like just one little snippet, because you still have to make like the swinging animations and stuff for your character, and you got to make a boss, which, like I said, use that humanoid model, turn into some giant boss fight, and then making that little snippet gives you kind of a taste of what it's like to make those larger experiences. And then definitely, I'd say when you're finished making it, share it. Just throw it out there. The game that I've made here will be on itch.io for free. Link in the description to check it out. I'd really appreciate you checking it out and just giving me feedback about what you think about it in the comments of this video after you're done playing. I'd say the most valuable feedback for me is when it comes to pacing of the level. Like, is there one encounter that ends too fast, or is there, flip side, one that feels like it's dragging too long and you're like, I wish this was 20 seconds shorter than it actually is. On top of that, just general game feel too is huge for me, for making the game feel better to play. I'd say the least valuable feedback is just graphics. Saying my custom-made assets look mid would be a compliment, and that's not really why I got into game development. It was more just to make something fun to play, not something that looks pretty. So I hope that listening to this was interesting, maybe even inspiring if you haven't started game dev, or maybe you dabbled in it just a little bit and we're starting to get some doubts. Just like I said, follow someone's guide to a T, but then make something that's your own out of what they have shown you how to make, and then hopefully that sparks inspiration for you to continue your path, and hopefully you make something that you're proud of the same way I'm proud of making what I've made. That's all I got for you. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.